In screwed news, last night, Senate Democrats and Republicans agreed to a plan that will retroactively prevent student loan interest rates from doubling from 3.4 to 6.8%. Under the plan, interest rates for all newly issued federal student loans will be tied to the 10-year Treasury note rate, with an additional 2.05 to 10.5% tacked on, depending on the type of loan it is. If signed into law, the Senate's compromise will help stop rate jumps for now, but it still doesn't change the fact that the United States is in the throes of what is, by all accounts, a full-blown student loan crisis. Student loan debt in the United States now totals over $1 trillion and counting. For all the Republican talk about the crushing impact of sovereign debt, government debt, on the American economy, it is private debt in the form of student loan obligations, credit card debt, and mortgages that is the real drag on the economy and the middle class. So when will Washington wake up and do something about it? Let's ask Steve Keen, professor of economics and finance at the University of Western Sydney and author of the book Debunking Economics. Professor Keen, welcome back to the United States and to our program.
Glad to be back on the program. I'm a bit worried about being back in the States with problems like that about to hit you.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, I'm guessing you don't have student loans.
We do have student loans. We've actually originated the whole idea of students borrowing money to pay for their education.
In Australia?
Yeah, yeah.
Really?
And frankly, I think it was always a mistake. For a whole lot of reasons. I'm now an ex-academic, by the way. My university shut down my economic department earlier this year. I'm now retrenched along with a dozen of my colleagues. So I call myself the world's most famous unemployed economist, courtesy of that particular farce. But what's the student loans, from my point of view as a teacher, have done is the students turn at university not focusing upon learning and education, but focusing upon financing their way through as well as they can, getting their education as quickly as they can, and they really aren't trying to learn, they're trying to get a credential. And we've devalued education by putting a monetary value on it, particularly in the form of debt.
Right. And student loan debt now in the United States is $1 trillion, but that's only a small piece of the total private sector debt. Now the Republicans and so-called deficit hawks are all hysterical about the government debt and the government deficit. The annual deficit has actually declined over the last couple of years during the Obama administration, but still it's substantial. And the government debt continues to grow, but it's roughly equal to our GDP right now. Why should we not be hysterical about that? And if so, is there something else we should be hysterical about?
Well, we have to see what actually caused the problem you're in, and identifying the public debt as the cause of the crisis is a bit like identifying the Band-Aid as to why your arm is bleeding. I mean, you put a Band-Aid on after you've been injured, and the injury was done to the American economy by escalating levels of private debt that financed a speculative bubble and a spending boom. Everybody was very happy when everybody was borrowing money and spending it on Main Street. But when that borrowing stopped, and it stopped pretty much on a dime in 2008, the decline in private debt growth is actually what triggered the crisis. Now, you should never have had that level of private debt growth to begin with. The banks did irresponsible lending, but while they were doing it, that's what gave you that apparent boom from '93 right through to 2007, 2008. So it's private spending that caused the bubble, and it's the collapse of private spending that caused the downturn, and public debt rose in response to that simply because, first of all, tax receipts declined because incomes fell, and welfare payments went up because unemployment rose. So the government was a passive response to the injury done by the private sector, and that's why I liken it more like to a Band-Aid rather than the actual injury.
Right. So to further define terms, just for people who are watching who may not be familiar with these, when we're talking about public debt, of course, we're talking about the government debt.
Yeah.
When we're talking about private debt, we're not just talking about student loans, and we're credit card debt, home mortgages, corporate debt.
Yeah.
What else am I missing? The debt banks
this is one of the great problems. I've actually been working right now with an organisation you may know of called the Governors Woods Foundation, which has established a project called Debunking-Economics.org, which is trying to define globally what the level of private debt is, because statisticians don't collect data about debt the way that I would like them to do. So what they record is every last form of debt. Now, some forms of debt don't have the macroeconomic consequences that other forms do. And what matters to me is when banks create debt, they simultaneously create money. Double entry bookkeeping, that's all it comes down to. And that expands the amount of economic activity when it's going up. It contracts the amount of economic activity when that's going down. So that's the debt I want to identify. And strictly speaking, having just done this work just recently with the Governors Wood Foundation, it's only in the last couple of weeks I've realised that I've been including in financial sector debt, which some of which is genuinely should be counted, but some of it's borrowing that banks themselves do from other banks, which doesn't have any impact on.
Yeah,
so that's a long-winded answer, but the bottom line is you need to add basically what the Federal Reserve records in the flow of funds is household debt, which is consumer debt plus mortgages, and business debt, non-financial business debt.
And what's the total of that
that's
private debt in the United States?
That's about $28 to $30 trillion.
Okay, and our government debt is in the neighborhood of 15 to 16 trillion, isn't
About
it?
14 trillion.
14 trillion.
So you've got at least twice the level of private debt that you have of government debt.
And that private debt should be what?
I think for the comfortable functioning of the American economy, that debt should be of the order of 5 to 10 trillion.
Wow.
Yeah.
And has it historically been at that level?
In terms of a ratio to GDP, yes, it has been. If you go back to what I regard as the golden age of the American economy, from the 1950 through to about 1965, the debt ratio was rising, but it was in the order of 40 to 80% in that range. Now, ever since it got past 100%, which it exceeded during the late 60s, early 70s, then you started having compounding of debt, and the lending being focused really on not financing, General Motors as an industrial corporation, but General Motors as a financial speculator,
right?
That sort of thing. So you shifted
Which literally is GMAC.
Yeah, you've shifted over from being an investment, industrially focused economy across to a speculative gambling economy,
right? And
it's all been driven by the rising level of debt, which the banks have pumped out because fundamentally banks profit by creating debt.
So we've got a private debt that's more than 200% of GDP. And
well, not more. There's having now it's of the order of 160, 180%, and falling right now.
And falling.
Yeah.
And which is a good thing.
Good because it should be going down, but when it goes down, it drags the whole economy with it, and that's the dilemma.
And so private debt and so public debt should be going up to compensate.
To compensate to some degree, I think we should actually be abolishing some of the private debt. We let the banks create far too much money. Certainly, the whole subprime fiasco, no other way to describe it,
right,
was lenders creating debt because on their short-term returns, it made them.
Now there are people who are suggesting that we used to say we will pay for an education to the point where a young person is ready to enter the economy.
Yeah.
Okay. In the 1800s, that was the 6th grade or the 8th grade. Then in the early 1900s. Or through the 1900s. By the early 20th century, it became the 10th grade, then the 12th grade.
Yeah.
And then it stopped at the 12th grade. And we kind of froze it there. And now we're saying, now we're going to extract money from you. There are people who are saying, it really should be all the way to PhD now, like most of the European countries do. Why don't we just wipe out that $1 trillion worth of student loan debt?
That is one thing, yes.
So
yes.
is that a
That would be a sensible, and that's because it's on the government's books. That's something the government can actually abolish on its own accord.
Much of it's on the government's books.
Yeah, yeah.
Much of it's held by private banks.
Yeah,
but
yeah. I mean, they've got caught up in the whole game. Yeah. But to me, that is a totally not only unproductive debt, it's counterproductive.
Right.
Because first of all, people study less well. I've seen enough research now to back up the feeling that I've had as an academic over the 40 years that I've been an intellectual and 20 years I've been a working academic. I've felt this decline in the quality of the student cohort, and not just that's partly because the number of the range of students has expanded over time, but it's also because for the whole lot of them, they're now focused on paying their student debt down before they graduate.
Well,
not on learning.
And after they graduate, if they're carrying tens of thousands of dollars in debt, they don't get married, they don't enter the job force quickly enough. When they do, they don't buy a home, which is the beginning of middle class wealth, genuine wealth accumulation, equity generation, all those kind of things. So government, let's talk about government debt for a minute then. If government debt could be, here's the counter argument. People say, okay, you got government debt that's at about 100% of GDP, almost. Yeah. If government debt was to exceed 100% of GDP, oh my God, we owe more than we own. You know, the world is going to fall apart, and the price of gold is going to go to $6,000 an ounce, and Hitler's going to run the country.
Yeah. Well, Hitler almost ran the country back in the Second World War, and the reason he didn't end up running the country
at least in Europe
was because of the level of government debt that was taken out with absolutely no regard as whether it could be paid back or not to finance building all the tanks and building all the planes and sending over the soldiers and paying their salaries that defeated the Nazis. And at the end of that level, American public debt was of the order of about 120% of GDP.
Right. So
Now,
we've had worse debt in the United
much worse
States than
debt
we
than
have
you've got
right now.
And the reason the debt fell is not that you paid it off all that much. It's that the economy, when it was booming at that stage, had something which was really, 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 really bad, according to the same people you're paraphrasing right now, high inflation. And what that high inflation did was it reduced the debt level over time.
Right.
And that at the same time, the economy was booming.
Right. We had almost full employment. Well, we had full employment during World War II, and we had close to full employment throughout the 50s and 60s.
Certainly much healthier than you're getting these days. I mean, it was a crisis when it was above 4%. Back in those days. Now it'd be hallelujah when it got below 6. So your mind has shifted about what's good and what's bad in terms of unemployment.
So we didn't pay off. We were at 127% of GDP in terms of debt after World War II. We did not pay that off through Republican austerity. We did not pay that off by cutting back. We did not pay that off by cutting any programs. We paid that off by borrowing and spending like crazy and building a highway system and schools and hospitals. That's what Eisenhower was doing, right? All those years.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's what you're suggesting we should be doing now?
Yeah, but we've let the private debt get so totally out of control that one reason you could do that was back in the end of the Second World War, the private debt was about 25% of GDP.
And now it's 200%.
Now it's 200%.
So we've got a problem.
The reason you got out of the crisis, and I hate to say this, but it's the empirical truth. What got America and the global economy out of the crisis was the Second World War.
Right.
And the sheer scale of government spending then. And with all that spending going on, the private sector could pay its debt down.
Right.
And get over.
Nobody noticed. It didn't hurt anything.
Yeah,
so now if the private sector pays off its debt, quickly it causes a recession or even a depression.
Yeah, because there isn't the compensating spending going on.
So we have to compensate for that by government spending, and the worst way to do that, of course, is to have a war.
Yeah.
But an alternative would be what? Massive infrastructure building?
That'd be one alternative, and that's certainly the state of American infrastructure. I managed not to go on a. I was quite enjoying a first interview on a conservative radio station in Seattle, and I wanted to go back and talk about this whole issue of quantitative easing and so on, and what it actually means. So we had a very intelligent host and enjoying the conversation. Set up the next day. I didn't make the interview because a bridge in Seattle collapsed.
Yeah. Okay.
So you really have got, crumbling, literally crumbling infrastructure. Yeah. So you would definitely spend that money wisely.
Yeah, indeed. Steve Keen, it's always great seeing you. Dr. Keen, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.